L.A.G, or Latent Automaton Gangrene, is a short story written and performed by David Lawson. We hope you enjoy L.A.G, Part 1. This is either going to be the best date ever, or the worst, Sam thought as he took in the sights around him. The sun shone through the clouds, creating a speckled landscape of rustling green hues. It was hard to believe so much grass could exist indoors. It was even harder to comprehend that the flowing landscape around him was largely synthetic. But Sam had to admit it was possible. After all, he was every bit as artificial. He took a bite of his food and mulled over the phrase, artificial. He had always hated it. That word came with all the baggage and imagery of a forgery or a cheap copy. So what if the womb he was born in had been made from metal instead of flesh? Did it really matter if his heart moved the essential liquids of his body at a constant stream rather than a rhythmic pump? Sam didn't think so. He took another bite of his ice cream and really savored it. A small report on the various ingredients popped up on his internal display, but he closed his eyes and mentally whisked them away. He didn't want to analyze this treat. He wanted to experience it. A machine could analyze. Only a person could meaningfully experience. Sam knew in his soul he was a person, and the church assured him that he had a soul. Well, at least most of them did. "Whoa, if you like that ice cream so much, you should go on a date with it instead," a female voice full of mocking glee called out to him as she came to sit on the bench. Sam opened his eyes, and he was sure that if his heart had a beat, then it would have skipped one. Barkflower grinned at him. Her entire thin form swayed from her laughing, causing her long, wispy hair to flow around her, as if her very voice caused an unfelt wind to pool and swirl around. Her pink tress ruffled in time with her hair in an enchanting pattern all her own, and her smile seemed to play off the alluring sparkle in her eyes. Barkflower was from a race of people whose bodies resembled flora more than fauna. Her skin was made of bark. A thin moss covered various parts as well. Believing Sam to be human, Barkflower had even begun to take on human hygiene and fashion, wearing dresses and shaving the moss from her legs. She had worked so hard to make herself fit into Sam's world, and it always amazed him to no end. Did I hit the jackpot or what? They hadn't even been dating too incredibly long, but for Sam, it had been long enough to know the most important thing. He loved her, or at least it was the beginning of love. He had enough data to pull from to understand that love was a process or a choice, rather than an emotion. And that was the very distinction, however, that made it all the more clear to him. His emotions were carefully regulated, to help him function as closely to a human as possible. Like everything else, they were artificial, but his choices were his own. His decisions were his own. Sometimes he worried that what he felt wasn't real, that he couldn't trust his own emotions. But his decisions were something only he decided. That much he knew from the course of his own life. It gave him comfort and confidence in his choice today. If love was a choice, then he had chosen this day to fall head first into it with Barkflower. That meant the only thing left for him to do was to hope she would make the same choice. Of course, that choice would only really be valid if she made it with the right information. That meant coming clean about his life as an automaton. He hadn't really meant to hide it from her. It just wasn't the sort of thing you brought up on the first date. Or the second, really. Or the 12th. All the same, Sam understood that if he was going to tell her he loved her, get a genuine response back, then she needed to know the truth. Some trigger in his thought process activated a release of adrenaline into his system. He could feel his muscles tense up and his blood ran colder than usual. Sam thanked God and his makers that he couldn't really sweat, because he was sure his palms would be drenched right now if he could. "You are really spacing out on me today, Sam," Barkflower said, her smirk tinged with both amusement and concern. "And don't tell me you cheated on me with some slutty double scoop in a chocolate skirt." They both laughed, and Sam set down his ice cream, flipping a switch on his bowl that kept his meal from melting further. "Nah, nothing like that, but there's something I want to talk about." Barkflower tilted her head, and a small pop-up on his internal display let Sam know that she was releasing pheromones that indicated some sort of mood change. He once again closed out the report before he read it. Sam wanted to do this on his own, as a person, not just a machine. I wanted to tell you something," Sam started nervously, clearing his throat for no real reason. "But to tell you that something, I have to tell you something else first." "And before that, you needed to tell me about it?" she asked, biting back a smile. Sam laughed again nervously, but pressed on. "BK, I have to come clean with you. I'm not exactly—" He gulped back the extra fluid his servos had sent to his mouth from the food and fear. "I'm not exactly a normal human being," he finally managed to get out, squeezing his eyes shut in absolute and unmitigated terror. A barrage of vital warnings indicated that he was under extreme duress popped up so fast that Sam couldn't shoo them away. Barkflower giggled at him quietly and said, "Sappy, I knew you weren't normal the moment I met you," and continued chortling quietly. Sam took a deep breath, clearing his internal display of warnings, trying again to explain. "That's not what I mean. I'm not human at all. I'm actually an automaton." He braced himself against the swell of emotions from inside and the shock and anger from outside. He knew he should have been upfront earlier, and he would have to pay the price now. All those times he could have said something, but couldn't work up the courage, haunted him now. He had wanted so much for her to like him. He hadn't wanted to scare her away. Now he knew it was time to pay the bill for his silence. Sam waited for what must have only been moments, but felt like an eternity for any kind of response from the woman he had chosen to love. Then, she laughed. Barkflower threw her head back and laughed so hard, her hair fluttered in the breeze it made. "I knew that too, you dunce!" She wiped away a tear that had formed from her crying with laughter. You did?" Sam looked at her, both relieved and confused. "But how? No one's ever been able to tell the difference just by looking at me." Sam looked down in shame. "And it's not as if I was very upfront about it." Barkflower tapped him on the head and brushed his bangs out of his face. "You remember how Barkflower isn't my real name?" she asked with a grin that spoke of playful tenderness. "Well, of course," Sam started. "Your people communicate through pheromones, and your real name is closer to a smell than a word. Barkflower's just the best approximation, right?" "Yeah, that's right." She started to shake from the attempt of holding back her laughter. "But you know we can smell pheromones, not just put them out. How else would we communicate with them?" Sam wasn't sure what was so funny or what she was getting at, so he waited as patiently as he could, his face frozen in nervous confusion. Barkflower laughed a while longer before finally explaining. "We can smell pheromones from other people too, Sam. Including humans?" Sam smacked his own forehead as the pieces fell into place. "I don't give off any pheromones, do I?" "No!" Barkflower doubled over in laughter on the bench they were sitting on. "Not even a little bit!" She stamped her feet and continued to giggle while Sam let a sheepish smile form across his face. "So, you knew—" "The entire time!" Barkflower continued to try and fail to hold back her mirth. "And you thought I didn't know? I thought you were just uncomfortable talking about it. You really didn't think that I knew?" She leaned in close with a smile and kissed his cheek. "You're an idiot, Samuel, and I adore you." She smelled like wildflowers in bloom, and her lips were as soft as rose petals on his cheek. Sam's thought process went fuzzy, and he couldn't think clearly at all. When he managed to come back to his senses, several more pop-ups had come up that he hadn't noticed, warning him about more than he cared to read. A number were marked urgent, but he didn't bother looking at them. He mentally set his internal display to Do Not Disturb, ensuring no further pop-ups of any kind would show up. "So, now that we have your deep, dark secret out of the way, what was the part 2 you wanted to talk about?" She brushed her own hair out of her face as she leaned in close. Sam couldn't be sure, but she seemed almost excited to him. Sam turned to face her straight on, and took both of her hands in his. He'd been preparing what to say for days now. "I love you, Barkflower. Your beautiful smile is only surpassed by the splendor of your character, and I want nothing more than to seriously pursue a relationship with you with the intent to marry." Sam had agonized over every word, and now he took a deep breath, ready to say it to her. Instead, he froze. Just as he was about to speak, Sam found himself utterly unable to say the words he so desperately wanted to. It wasn't fear that stopped him. He knew that at once. It was something much worse. His entire body was motionless, exactly as it had been for the past 7 seconds. Not a single muscle would twitch. Not a single eyelid could flutter. He was totally aware of everything going on, but entirely helpless to do anything. In a panic, he attempted to squeeze Barkflower's hands, yell for help, anything that would indicate the situation he was in. His body would not obey in the slightest. Sam remained stock still. "Are you okay, Sam?" Barkflower asked, squeezing his hand a bit. "You don't have to be nervous. It's me you're talking to." "Sam?" She removed one of her hands and waved it in front of his face. He was completely unresponsive. He tried to scream out a response, but his body defied him. Barkflower was genuinely worried at this point. Sam could see her reach into her pocket and pull out a comm unit. "I'm gonna call for help now, okay?" she said slowly while entering the contact information for a paramedic. Suddenly, and against his will, Sam found his hands squeezing painfully tight and the words spilling out unbidden from his mouth. I love you, Barkflower. Your beautiful smile is only surpassed by the splendor of your character, and I want nothing more to seriously pursue a relationship with the attempt to marry him. I love you, Barkflower. What's going on? I can't talk. Hey, help. I can't move. Yes, I can see you, but I can't move. Please call for help. I don't know what's happening to me. Please don't leave. All came spilling out at once. At the same time, the one hand Barkflower had left in his was instantly crushed. It made the horrifying sound of twigs snapping, and her brown wooded fingers bent out at odd angles. Try as he might, Sam couldn't will his hand to release her. Barkflower cried out in pain and clenched her wounded hand with her free one, dropping her comm in the process. Fell several feet away in the bright green grass, now partially covered in thick brown blood. What's wrong, Sam? Why are you doing this? Barkflower cried out as she tried to wrench herself from his grasp. I don't know! Sam screamed in his head, but his mechanical body would not answer. He willed with all his might to release her and pull away to no avail, his mechanical grip shattering her natural plant-like hand. Barkflower cried and pulled as hard as she could in an attempt to reach for her comm. It was well outside the range of her hand, laying several feet away in the grassy hill, and despite her best efforts, she was nowhere near grabbing it. Barkflower squeezed her eyes shut and whimpered in pain. At the same time, she dug her bare foot as far into the ground as she could. Unlike much of the sky and grass, the dirt was real, and Sam now saw that would be her saving grace. Sam couldn't move his eyes at all, but thankfully he could see from the corner of his vision the small vine-like roots traveled through the ground from Barkflower's foot to the comm, and slowly, too slowly, began to pull it back. Sam wept internally as Barkflower's hand continued to make creaking and cracking noises within his merciless grip. Barkflower fought through the pain and managed to pull the comm to her free hand, where she finished inputting the call for help. Hello? Yes, we're at the Floor 19 park on the west side. There's been some sort of accident, she gasped out between sharp pains of breath. Please, bring a paramedic, and a mechanic as well. She shot Sam an apologetic look, but continued. My boyfriend is seized up, and my hand, it... Suddenly, Sam's body began to move again. He released Barkflower's hand and flung himself off the bench, screaming in fear. He realized in horror that his exact mental reaction about 60 seconds ago was playing out live now. He willed himself to sit, lay flat on his back, and say, I can see, I can hear, I can't control my body. Everything's delayed. But despite his best efforts, he continued to jerk back and scream as his body tumbled down the hill towards the lake. He panicked and began to try and jerk away from it, but he continued to roll, screaming and crying down the hill. Despite her injury, Barkflower chased after his flailing body and tried to grab him and keep him from rolling into the lake. Her slender form did little to impede his manic progress into the lake. She screamed and pulled frantically, trying to keep him out of the water, but his flailing made it impossible. Almost 3 minutes after he had willed it, his body finally went still. He lay on his back, 4 feet underwater, repeating ad nauseum, I can see, I can hear, I can't control my body, everything's delayed, when all he wanted to say was, I'm so sorry.